The man had been dying for 6 hours. That is where we need to start. Not with theology, not with prophecy, with a man on a cross outside the walls of Jerusalem on a Friday afternoon, in the kind of heat that makes the air above the stones shimmer and the flies relentless and the crowd thin out, because there is only so long you can stand in the sun watching someone die. His name was Jesus. He was from Galilee. Rome had sentenced him to crucifixion, which was not a punishment reserved for the worst criminals in any moral sense. It was a punishment reserved for people who were considered a problem, a public problem, the kind that needed to be solved visibly, so that everyone walking past on the road into the city would understand what happened to problems. By the time the afternoon was well underway, most of the crowd had drifted. The soldiers were still there because that was their job. A small group of women who had followed him from Galilee were still there, watching from a distance, because they could not make themselves leave. And the 2 men crucified on either side of him were still there because they had no choice. Then, at a specific hour on that specific afternoon, he died. And here is the detail that nobody talks about enough. 4 people wrote accounts of this death. They wrote in different cities, for different audiences, years and sometimes decades apart. They left out things you would expect them to include. They disagreed on details that seemed like they should have been easy to get right. They never once described what Jesus looked like. No height, no face, no detail of his hands or his voice that would let you pick him out of a crowd. But all of them wanted you to know what time it was when he died. 3 in the afternoon. Why? That is the only question this story is trying to answer. And the answer is stranger and deeper and more interesting than you probably expect. Pick up any of the 4 Gospels and read through them slowly, and you will notice something that most people never notice because they are moving too fast to catch it. The writers almost never tell you what time it is. Jesus heals a blind man. No time given. He feeds 5,000 people on a hillside. No time given. He walks on water. Rises Lazarus. Tells the story of the prodigal son. Argues with the Pharisees in the temple courts. No timestamps on any of it. These writers made choices about what to include and what to leave out. And for most of the story, the hour of the day was not something they considered worth recording. So when Mark, in the 15th chapter of his Gospel, suddenly becomes very specific about time, that specificity is not a small thing. Jesus is brought to the place of crucifixion at the 3rd hour. Darkness comes over the land at the 6th hour. At the 9th hour, Jesus cries out, and then he dies. 3 timestamps in a single chapter, from a writer who almost never gives you one. Matthew follows Mark through most of this sequence, but quietly drops the 3rd hour. Luke keeps the darkness and the 9th hour. John builds an entirely different framework around the timing of the Passover preparation. And yet across all 4 accounts, in their different ways, the death of Jesus is placed inside a specific stretch of afternoon time. Now here is the thing that takes a moment to really land. Most scholars today regard Mark as the earliest gospel, and Markan priority has become the dominant view in modern gospel studies. Mark wrote fast and lean. His gospel is the shortest. He uses the Greek word that gets translated as immediately more than 40 times. He has no patience for scenes that do not move the story forward. Every word in Mark is carrying weight, which means when Mark stops and tells you the hour, he is not being thorough. He is making a point. The question is, what point? There is a way that ancient writers used time that modern readers miss almost completely. And it is worth slowing down to understand it, because it changes how you read everything that follows. We live in a world where 3 in the afternoon is a neutral fact. It is a position on a clock. It has no personality, no history, no association, beyond whatever happens to be scheduled for that moment on your calendar. Time, for us, is a container, uniform, consistent, empty until something fills it. That is not how the people who wrote the Gospels experienced time, and it is not how their first readers experienced it either. In the Jewish world of the first century, certain hours carried meaning, the way certain places carried meaning. The hour was not a neutral container. It was a location inside a larger order, an order built out of prayer and sacrifice and memory and the rhythms of the temple that had been organizing daily life in Jerusalem for centuries. When Mark wrote the 9th hour, his first readers did not reach for a clock. They reached for something older, something they had felt in their own bodies, in their own daily lives, long before anyone ever told them a story about a man dying on a hill outside the city walls. To feel what they felt, you have to understand what the 9th hour actually was in the world they lived in. And that means you have to leave the modern clock behind, because the modern clock is going to mislead you about almost everything that follows. Close your eyes for a moment and try to imagine a day with no clock on the wall. Not a day where you choose not to check your phone. A day where the technology does not exist. Where no one in your city, your country, your entire civilization has ever seen a device that divides time into fixed, equal units. Where the question, what time is it, would not make sense the way it makes sense to you right now. That is the world of first century Jerusalem. The day began when the sun came up over the hills to the east. It ended when the sun went down, and the hours between were not the standardized units we take for granted. They were proportional slices of whatever daylight was available. 12 hours in a day, always. But the length of each hour shifted with the seasons. A summer hour was longer than a winter hour because summer days were longer and those 12 slices had more light to divide. The hour was not a fixed container of 60 minutes. It was a fraction of the available light, and the available light was always changing. What this means in practice is that when Mark writes the 9th hour, he is not pointing to a number on a dial. He is pointing to a position in the arc of the day, roughly 3/4 of the way through the available daylight. The part of the afternoon when the sun has passed its peak and is beginning its descent toward the western hills. When the heat of the day is still heavy, but the light is starting to change color at the edges. But here is what matters far more than the astronomical position of the sun. People in first century Jerusalem did not organize their days around clock readings. They organized them around rhythm, a rhythm that had been built over centuries and that found its fullest expression inside the walls of the temple on the hill above the city. Picture a man named Ezra, a leather worker whose shop was in the lower city, just below the Temple Mount. He has been working since just after sunrise. He has no watch, no phone, no bell tower with a mechanical clock, but he knows exactly where he is in the day because his day has a shape, a sequence of events that tells him not just what hour it is, but what kind of hour it is. 3 times a day, Ezra stops what he is doing. Morning, afternoon, and evening. These are not optional moments of private devotion. They are the architecture of his day. Fixed points around which everything else arranges itself. The afternoon prayer, the one called Mincha, falls in the later part of the day. It falls in the stretch of afternoon that many readers would connect with the 9th hour, the time when the light is long and the shadows are beginning to reach eastward across the stone pavement of the temple courts. And inside the temple itself, that same stretch of afternoon carries something even more specific. Every single day, without exception, the priests perform what is called the tamid. The word means the continual or the perpetual. It is a daily sacrifice. 2 lambs, one in the morning and one in the afternoon. The afternoon tamid belongs to this same late afternoon rhythm of sacrifice and prayer. The lamb is brought to the altar. The priests gather. The Levites begin to sing. And the people who have come to the temple courts bow in prayer while the sacrifice is made. This is not a high holy day. This is not Passover or Yom Kippur or any of the great festival moments that mark the Jewish year. This is Tuesday. This is every single day. The daily heartbeat of temple worship. The sacrifice that happens in the late afternoon, whether it is the middle of a festival week or the most ordinary Wednesday of the most ordinary month of the year. Now go back to Ezra in his shop. He does not need a clock to know when the afternoon sacrifice is happening. He can hear the Levites singing from where he sits. He can smell the smoke from the altar if the wind is right. He has lived inside this rhythm his entire life. The afternoon sacrifice is not a scheduled event he has to remember. It is part of the shape of the day, the way the shape of his own breathing is part of the shape of being alive. When Mark writes that Jesus died at the 9th hour, this is the world he is writing inside. He is placing the death of Jesus at the hour when, inside the city walls, the daily sacrifice was reaching its completion. At the hour when Ezra, the leather worker, and thousands of other ordinary people in Jerusalem were either in the temple courts or turning toward them in prayer. Mark is not being subtle. He is not hiding a message for scholars to decode 15 centuries later. He is writing in a language that his first readers spoke fluently, a language built out of the rhythms of a day that every Jewish person in Jerusalem lived inside from birth. The 9th hour was already a sacred hour before Jesus ever walked into Jerusalem. It had been a sacred hour for as long as the temple had been standing, and the people who first heard Mark's gospel would have felt the weight of that the moment they heard which hour it was. But here is where the story gets complicated in a way that most accounts of this subject are not honest enough to admit. Because if you go looking for the simple version of this, the version that says Jesus died at the exact same moment the Passover lambs were being slaughtered, you are going to find it everywhere. In books, in sermons, in documentaries, in articles written by people who find the image as powerful as it sounds. And the image is powerful. But the 4 Gospels do not quite tell that story. And the way they do not quite tell it is actually more interesting than the clean version. Here is the sentence you have probably heard. Jesus died at the exact same moment the Passover lambs were being slaughtered in the temple. It gets repeated everywhere. The image is almost too perfect. Outside the city walls, Jesus dying on a cross. Inside the temple, the knives coming down on the lambs. The same hour, the same blood, The whole thing locked together like something that was arranged long before any of the people involved were born. The problem is that the four Gospels do not quite tell that story, and the way they do not quite tell it is actually more interesting than the clean version. To understand why, you have to understand that the four Gospel writers did not all place the death of Jesus on the same day of the Jewish calendar. This is not a detail that gets discussed much outside of academic circles, because it is genuinely uncomfortable, but it is there in the text, and it has been there for 2,000 years. And the people who have looked at it most carefully have not been able to make it disappear by reading more carefully. Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell the story this way. The Last Supper is a Passover meal. Jesus and his disciples gather in Jerusalem to eat the Passover together, which means the lambs have already been slaughtered that afternoon, already been roasted, already been eaten. The meal happens, then the arrest, then the trials through the night, then the crucifixion the following morning, death in the afternoon. If that timeline is right, Jesus died on the 15th of Nisan, the day after the Passover lambs were killed. John tells the story differently. In John, the Last Supper happens before Passover, when Jesus is standing before Pilate on the morning of the trial. John makes a point of telling you that the Jewish leaders would not enter the Roman governor's residence. They did not want to become ritually impure before eating the Passover, which means in John's account, the Passover meal has not happened yet, which means Jesus is being tried and condemned on the 14th of Nisan, the preparation day, the afternoon when the lambs are being brought to the temple. If John's timeline is right, Jesus died at roughly the same time the Passover lambs were being slaughtered. Same death. 2 different days on the Jewish calendar, depending on which gospel you are reading. Now sit with this for a moment, because this is the detail that most popular accounts skip over, and skipping it costs you something. John is the gospel that most aggressively builds the image of Jesus as the Lamb of God. It is John, and only John, who puts those exact words in the mouth of John the Baptist in chapter 1, before Jesus has performed a single miracle or spoken a single teaching. Behold the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world. John builds that image into the foundation of his entire account. It is there from the first pages, and it never goes away. And John is the gospel whose timeline allows that image to become most explicit. If John is right about the day, then Jesus died while the Passover lambs were being slaughtered in the temple courts. The Gospels that do not use the Passover lamb imagery as aggressively are the ones whose chronology does not quite fit that picture. Scholars have wrestled with this for a very long time. Some argue John shaped his timeline to make the symbolism work. Others argue John preserved an older historical tradition that the other 3 modified. Others point to evidence that different Jewish communities in the 1st century may have observed Passover on different days, using different calendar systems, and that the apparent contradiction reflects real diversity in practice rather than error in the text. None of those arguments has fully closed the case. All of them are held by serious people who have devoted careers to exactly these questions. What we can say with confidence is something simpler and more important than any of those arguments. The connection between Jesus and Passover that all 4 Gospels are making is not a stopwatch argument. They are not asking you to synchronize 2 clocks and notice that the hands line up at a specific minute. They are doing something older And stranger than that, they are placing this death inside a world of meaning, a world where Passover was not just a date on a calendar, but a whole way of understanding what happens when people are trapped with no way out. And to feel the full weight of what that means, you have to understand what Passover actually was, not as a concept, as a lived experience in a city that transformed completely for 1 week every year. Because Jerusalem during Passover week was not the city, it was the other 51 weeks of the year. And if you were standing in that city on that Friday afternoon, you could not have watched what was happening on the hill outside the walls without the whole weight of that festival pressing in around the edges of everything you saw. Walk into Jerusalem on the Wednesday before Passover, and you will understand immediately that something is different. The city is louder. The streets are narrower than they should be, because people are moving through them in both directions at once. Families with children and bundles of belongings. Groups of men from the same village traveling together the way people travel when the road is long and there is safety in numbers. The smell of the city has changed. More animals, more smoke, more bodies. More food being prepared in courtyards and on rooftops by women who have been calculating quantities for weeks, because you do not run out of food during Passover. Not when your family has traveled this far to be here. Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian who had absolutely no interest in making anything about this week sound more dramatic than it was, estimated that the crowds flooding into Jerusalem for the major festivals were enormous. His specific numbers are almost certainly exaggerated, as ancient historians figure tend to be. But even a fraction of what he describes would have made the city feel like a different place entirely. Passover was one of 3 pilgrimage festivals in the Jewish calendar, the ones where Jewish men were traditionally expected to appear before God at the temple. People came from all over Judea, from the Galilee in the north, from diaspora communities scattered across the Roman world, from Egypt, from Babylon, from cities throughout the empire where Jewish families had been living for generations. They came because they were supposed to, but they also came because of what the festival was. Passover was not a memorial service. It was not the kind of ceremony where you sit quietly and remember something that happened to other people a long time ago. The liturgy that governed the Passover meal was explicit on this point in a way that made it unlike almost any other religious observance in the ancient world. The obligation was not to retell the story of the Exodus from Egypt. The obligation was to experience it as though it had happened to you personally. The text was direct about this. In every generation, a person is obligated to see themselves as though they personally left Egypt, not your ancestors. You. The Hebrew word for Egypt, Mitzrayim, carries inside it a root that means narrow place, a place of constriction, a place you cannot get out of on your own. Every year, Jewish families sat down around a table and placed themselves inside that narrow place. And then they moved through the story of being pulled out of it. You ate bitter herbs to remember the bitterness of slavery. You dipped them in a paste that looked like the mortar used for making bricks. You ate unleavened bread because there was no time to wait for it to rise when the moment of release came. You drank 4 cups of wine, one for each of the promises God made to Israel in the book of Exodus. And at the center of the meal, the lamb. In the time when the temple was standing, the Passover lamb was not a symbol. It was an animal your family brought to Jerusalem, a lamb set aside on the 10th of Nisan, kept for 4 days, then carried to the temple on the 14th. The temple courts on that afternoon were unlike anything a modern person would easily picture. Thousands of families arriving with their animals. The priests organizing the slaughter in shifts because there was no other way to handle the sheer volume of it. Blood collected in basins and passed from hand to hand up to the altar. Smoke rising. The Levites singing the Hallel, the great psalms of praise that begin with Psalm 113 and end with Psalm 118. The whole thing loud and physical and overwhelming in the way that only something involving thousands of people and fire and blood and ancient liturgy can be. Then the families carried their lambs home, roasted them whole, according to the instructions in Exodus, with fire, not boiled in water. And that night, when the stars came out, and the day changed from the 14th to the 15th of Nisan, they gathered around the table. The oldest person present began to speak. We were slaves in Egypt. Not they were. We were. This is the city Jesus rode into on what we now call Palm Sunday. This is the atmosphere pressing in on every conversation, every meal, every walk through the crowded streets during the week of his arrest and death. Every person in Jerusalem was saturated in this story. The story of a people who had been trapped in a place they could not escape. And then something happened that they had no power to make happen themselves. And they were free. Now picture that same city on Friday afternoon. The festival either just finished or is about to reach its center, depending on which gospel you are reading. The streets are still full. The temple is still active. And outside the north wall of the city, on a low hill, the travelers on the road from the north would pass directly. 3 men are being executed by Rome. The Roman soldiers carrying out the execution are not living inside the Passover story. For them, it is crowd control season, the worst week of the year for a garrison posted in a city like this. Because festival crowds are unpredictable, and the history of this particular festival includes enough incidents of tension and violence that the governor himself has come down from his comfortable residence on the coast to be present in the city. But everyone else on that road, every pilgrim walking past that hill, every person who glances up at the 3 crosses, is living inside a story about slavery and deliverance. And the night something from outside ordinary human power came and made a way where there was no way. You cannot watch a crucifixion during Passover week in Jerusalem and keep those 2 things in separate rooms in your mind. The festival will not stay in its room. It comes through the walls. And the people who later wrote the Gospels, who had grown up reciting those same words at those same tables, who knew what it felt like to sit inside the Passover story and feel it as their own story, could not tell the death of Jesus without that flooding in. It was not a theological decision they made after careful deliberation. It was the only way they knew how to see, which is why the hour matters so much. Because when you understand what Passover was, and what the 9th hour was, and what it meant to have those 2 things in the same city on the same afternoon, the death of Jesus stops being a private tragedy on a hill outside the walls. It becomes something that the whole rhythm of that day seems to have been pointing toward. The prayers rising from the temple courts, the smoke from the altar, the songs the Levites were singing, the ancient machinery of Jewish sacred time, moving through its daily and yearly rhythms, all of it present in the same city, in the same afternoon, in the same hour. The Gospel writers did not invent that convergence. They witnessed it, and then they wrote it down in a way that made sure you would know what time it happened. But they were not the only people watching that afternoon. There was another set of eyes on that hill, eyes that saw everything that happened and carried none of the weight of Passover, none of the memory of Egypt, none of the language of the Psalms or the temple or the sacred rhythms of the Jewish day. Those were Roman eyes. And what one Roman said when it was over is something that nobody who was standing there expected to hear. The Roman soldier standing at the foot of the cross that Friday afternoon was not having a spiritual experience. He was doing his job. His name is not recorded. Mark calls him a centurion, which tells us something about who he was without giving us the detail we would want. A centurion commanded a unit of roughly 80 men. He was not a high-ranking officer in the political sense. He was experienced. He had risen through the ranks by being competent and reliable in situations that tested both of those qualities. He was the kind of man that Rome put in charge of things that needed to be done correctly. And a crucifixion needed to be done correctly because it was a public statement as much as a punishment. The whole point of crucifixion was visibility. This is what we do to problems. This is what happens to people who make themselves a threat to Roman order. The condemned man needed to die slowly enough that the lesson had time to register in the minds of everyone who walked past. He needed to be positioned where people would see him, and someone needed to stay there until it was finished and confirm that it was finished before the body could be released. That was the centurion's afternoon. He had almost certainly done this before. Crucifixion was not rare in the Roman world, particularly in occupied territories where the local population had a history of resistance. He knew what the process looked like. He knew how long it typically took. He knew the signs that told you it was almost over. And he knew that what was happening with this particular man was not typical. People who were crucified did not usually die in a few hours. The whole design of the punishment was extended suffering. Death by crucifixion came through a combination of exhaustion, exposure, and the progressive failure of the body to sustain itself in the position it was forced to hold. It typically took a day, sometimes two, sometimes longer. The soldiers at Golgotha that Friday had been prepared to be there well into the next day. When Jesus died at the 9th hour, after roughly 6 hours on the cross, that was fast enough to be unusual. Mark records that when Joseph of Arimathea came to ask for the body that evening, Pilate was surprised enough that he summoned the centurion specifically to ask whether death had already occurred. The centurion confirmed it. Pilate released the body. That detail is easy to read past, but it is worth stopping on. Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, was surprised that Jesus was already dead. Not concerned, not alarmed, just surprised, in the way you are surprised when something ends earlier than you expected. The centurion, the man who had been there watching the whole time, confirmed that it was over. These are not theological observations. They are bureaucratic ones. Rome had a procedure for this. Someone needed to verify the death before the body changed custody. The centurion was that person. He verified it, reported it, and his word was sufficient for the governor to release the remains. That is the Roman version of the 9th hour. An execution completed. A body confirmed dead. A governor briefly surprised by the timing. A file closed. And then Mark records what the centurion said. Not the governor, not the priests who had pushed for the execution, not the disciples who were not there. The centurion. Truly, this man was the Son of God. There is a strange power in testimony that comes from outside the circle of belief. This man had no framework for what the Son of God meant in the Jewish theological sense. He was not a follower. He was not someone who had heard the teachings or witnessed the healings or made any kind of commitment to what Jesus represented. He was Rome. He had been sent there to make sure a condemned man died properly and to confirm it when it was done. What he saw in those 6 hours, what specifically shifted something in a man whose profession required him to watch people die and feel nothing beyond professional detachment? Mark does not explain. He does not slow down to give us the centurion's interior experience. He simply records what the man said when it was over and moves on. The way he moves on from everything, trusting that the weight of the moment will do the work that explanation would only diminish. Scholars have argued for centuries about what the centurion actually meant. Some say he was using the phrase in the Roman sense, where Son of God was a title that could be applied to emperors and exceptional men and meant something closer to divinely favored than what the phrase carries in Christian theology. Some argue Mark is placing fully formed Christian belief into the mouth of a pagan as a literary device. Some take it as the honest response of a man who watched something he could not categorize and said the most accurate thing he could find words for. What is not debatable is the choice Mark made. He could have ended the crucifixion scene with the death. He could have moved directly to the women watching from a distance, to Joseph of Arimathea arriving with his request, to the practical business of what happens after a man dies on a cross. Instead, he pauses on this one soldier, this professional representative of the empire that carried out the execution, and records what that man said when it was over. The man who had been sent there to see it clearly, with no grief and no belief and no stake in the meaning of what he was watching, walked away from Golgotha saying something that nobody had asked him to say and that Rome had no category for. And inside the city, the sky had already been dark for 3 hours. Because before the centurion said what he said, before Jesus died at the 9th hour, before any of the final events of that afternoon unfolded, something happened at noon that nobody in Jerusalem that day had a natural explanation for. The light failed. At noon, the sky went dark. Matthew says it. Mark says it. Luke says it. All three of them record the same thing happening at the same moment, which, in a set of documents that disagree on plenty of details, is itself worth pausing on. From the 6th hour, which is noon, until the 9th hour, which is 3 in the afternoon, darkness came over the whole land. 3 hours, the middle of the day, the time when the sun should be at its highest and the shadows at their shortest. And instead, the light failed. The first question most people ask is the obvious one. Was it an eclipse? The answer is no. And the reason is simple enough that it does not require a degree in astronomy to follow. Passover falls on or near a full moon. The Jewish calendar is lunar, and Passover is tied specifically to the 14th and 15th of Nisan, which corresponds to the full moon of the first spring month. A solar eclipse requires the moon to pass directly between the Earth and the Sun, which can only happen during a new moon, when the moon is on the same side of the Earth as the Sun. During a full moon, the moon is on exactly the opposite side. A solar eclipse during Passover week is astronomically impossible, so it was not an eclipse. The text does not call it an eclipse, and the people who first heard this story would not have reached for that explanation. They would have reached for their scriptures. We do not know exactly what caused the darkness the gospel writers describe. And the honest answer is that the text does not tell us. What we do know is how that darkness would have sounded to the people who first heard this account. People who had grown up inside a tradition where darkness at midday was not a weather event, but a language. A very specific language, used in very specific circumstances, by writers whose words these people knew by heart. The prophet Amos, writing roughly 750 years before this Friday afternoon, recorded these words from God. "On that day I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight." The context is a declaration of judgment, a reckoning for failures of justice and faithfulness that have been accumulating too long. The darkening of the sun at noon is not a natural disaster in Amos. It is the signature of a moment when ordinary history is being interrupted by something that does not follow ordinary rules. Joel uses the same language. The sun and the moon go dark in the visions of the day of the Lord. The moment when the normal order of things gives way to something larger. And then there is the Exodus story itself, which was already saturating every conversation and every meal in Jerusalem that week. The 9th plague, the plague that came immediately before the death of the firstborn, was 3 days of darkness, so complete that the Egyptians could not see each other and could not move. 3 days of darkness, and then death, and then deliverance. The people who first heard Mark's account of 3 hours of darkness over Golgotha were not hearing a weather report. They were hearing a sound they recognized. The sound of a moment that the prophets had pointed at without being able to name it. The sound of Egypt, and judgment, and the darkness that comes just before everything changes. This is what it means to say that the gospel writers used time as a language. They were not just recording when things happened. They were placing what happened inside a world of meaning that their readers were already living inside. A world built out of texts and memories and the rhythms of sacred time that structured every day of their lives. 3 hours of darkness, from noon to the 9th hour. Think about what those 3 hours feel like inside the structure of the story. The crucifixion began at the 3rd hour. The sky went dark at the 6th hour. The darkness lasted until the 9th hour. The gospel writers have given you a clock, but it is not a clock that measures minutes. It is a clock that measures approach. The darkness is not the event. The darkness is the 3 hours before the event. The weight of accumulated meaning pressing down on a single afternoon in a single city. The held breath before whatever the 9th hour is going to bring. Ancient readers understood this instinctively because they lived inside a tradition where stories worked this way. The darkness before the death of the firstborn in Egypt was not decoration. It was preparation. You sat in the dark and you waited, and you knew that when the light returned, the world would not be the same world it was before the darkness came. Mark is doing the same thing at Golgotha. He is placing his reader inside 3 hours of failing light and asking them to wait. The 9th hour is coming, and when it arrives, after 3 hours of the sky behaving the way the sky behaves in the oldest and most shattering texts of the tradition, it will carry a weight that it could not have carried if the afternoon had simply been bright and ordinary from beginning to end. There is one more thing about these 3 hours that is easy to miss. The darkness ends at the 9th hour, not after the death, not after some other event that closes the sequence. The darkness lasts exactly until the moment Jesus cries out and dies. 3 hours of suspended wait, and then the 9th hour arrives. and the thing that has been building since noon finally breaks open. Mark does not explain the connection between the end of the darkness and the death. He does not need to. The structure does what the explanation would only reduce. You have been sitting in the dark for 3 hours inside this story, and by now you know enough about how this tradition works to know that when the darkness lifts, it will not lift gently. The 9th hour arrives, and the man on the cross opens his mouth and says something that nobody standing there expected to hear. He did not say it in Greek. Every word of the Gospels that has come down to us was written in Greek. That was the common language of the Roman world, the language that could travel across the widest possible geography and reach the widest possible audience. Mark wrote in Greek. Matthew wrote in Greek. Luke and John wrote in Greek. But when Mark records what Jesus said at the 9th hour, he does not translate it first. He writes it the way it sounded coming out of the man's mouth. The actual sounds, the actual language that Jesus spoke in his daily life. The Aramaic of Galilee and Jerusalem, and the dinner tables of ordinary Jewish families in the 1st century. Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani. And then Mark translates it. My God, why have you forsaken me? This is the last thing Mark records Jesus saying before he dies. The final words. And they are not a blessing, not a declaration, not a word of comfort to anyone nearby. They are a question, the oldest and hardest question a human being can ask of God, spoken directly, out loud, in a loud voice. Mark is careful to tell you that he cried out with a loud voice. This is not a man whispering in his final moments. This is a man using whatever strength he has left to make sure the words carry across the noise of the crowd and the soldiers and the city. Why have you forsaken me? Now here is what every reader in Mark's original audience would have known the moment those words landed. This is Psalm 22. The Psalms were not simply religious poetry in the 1st century Jewish world. They were the shared vocabulary of prayer, the words that an entire people had been reaching for in their moments of deepest need for centuries. They were memorized. They were sung in the temple. They were recited in the synagogues. They were the language of grief and praise and longing and faith that a community develops when it has been living together inside a story long enough for certain words to become communal property. A Jewish reader hearing my God, why have you forsaken me would not have needed to look it up. The recognition would have been immediate, and with the recognition would have come everything that follows in the psalm. Because you do not quote the first line of a text that your audience knows by heart without invoking the whole thing. Psalm 22 does not begin where most people think it ends. The opening lines are among the darkest in the entire collection. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me? So far from my cries of anguish. I cry out by day, but you do not answer. By night, but I find no rest. This is not a psalm of settled confidence. This is the prayer of a person who has been calling out and hearing nothing back, who is surrounded on every side, who is being mocked by people who tell him that if God really loved him, God would have done something by now. The psalm goes further. It describes a suffering so physical and so public that the people who were standing at Golgotha that Friday, watching what was happening to the man on the cross, would have felt a jolt of recognition moving through them as the words surfaced in their minds. All who see me mock me. They hurl insults and shake their heads. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. They divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment. These are not metaphors that the gospel writers found useful after the fact. These are descriptions of physical suffering and public humiliation that overlap with the crucifixion scene in ways that the people who were there would have recognized immediately. The mocking, the physical dissolution of a body under extreme stress, the soldiers casting lots for his clothing, which Mark has already mentioned earlier in the chapter. If you know Psalm 22. The crucifixion scene in Mark reads differently. The details that seem like historical specifics become something else, something layered, something that exists on more than one level at the same time. But here is the thing about Psalm 22 that changes everything if you follow it to where it actually goes. It does not end in abandonment. The psalm turns, not because the suffering stops, not because God arrives and removes the person from the situation. It turns because the person keeps praying, keeps addressing God even when God has not answered, keeps holding on to the relationship even when the relationship feels completely shattered. And somewhere in that persistence, the psalm moves from, "Why have you forsaken me?" to something that no one who heard only the opening line would have predicted. For he has not despised or scorned the suffering of the afflicted one. He has not hidden his face from him, but has listened to his cry for help. The psalm that begins with the most desolate opening line in the Hebrew Bible ends with the declaration that the cry was heard, that the one who seemed absent was not absent, that what looked from the inside like abandonment was not the final word on what was actually happening. When Jesus speaks that opening line at the 9th hour, he is not simply expressing despair. Readers formed by the Psalms would have recognized that he is praying a prayer that begins in the darkest place and carries inside its own structure the movement towards something on the other side of the darkness. He is not giving up. He is reaching for the one piece of language in his entire tradition that had already traveled from that darkness and come back with something to say about it. The people standing nearby do not all hear it that way. Mark records their confusion with a precision that feels almost painful. Some of them hear the word Eloi and think he is calling for Elijah. They wait to see if Elijah will come to take him down. Someone runs and soaks a sponge in wine vinegar and holds it up to his mouth on a stick. "Leave him alone," someone says. "Let us see if Elijah comes." They heard the sound of the words and missed the words entirely. They were standing in the presence of someone praying, the oldest prayer for the darkest moment in the tradition they all shared. And they reached for the explanation closest to hand. Mark does not judge them for it. He simply records it. And the recording of their confusion becomes a kind of wound in the text, a place where you can feel the distance between the surface of an event and the depth of its meaning, a distance that can exist even when you are standing close enough to touch the thing you are failing to understand. Jesus cries out again with a loud voice and breathes his last. Mark moves immediately. No pause, no reflection, no moment of narrator stepping in to tell you what to feel about what just happened. The next sentence is not about Jesus at all. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. This is where the full weight of the 9th hour finally lands. And it lands in an image that Mark does not explain. He does not say what the tearing means. He does not connect it explicitly to the death in the previous sentence. He simply places it there, In the next sentence, in the same breath, and trusts that the image will do what explanation would only make smaller. The curtain he is referring to was not a decorative element of the temple. It was a boundary, the division between the outer courts, where ordinary people could come and pray and bring their offerings, and the Holy of Holies, the innermost sanctuary, the place where the presence of God was understood to dwell in the most immediate and concentrated sense. Only the high priest could enter there, only once a year, only on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. After an elaborate sequence of ritual preparation that took days, the curtain communicated by its very presence that what was on the other side was not casually accessible, that the distance between ordinary human life and the holiness it was reaching toward was real and required to be taken seriously. It tore from top to bottom. The direction matters, and Mark knew it mattered. And the people who first heard this knew it mattered. Something tearing from the bottom is something being pulled apart by human hands reaching up to what they can touch. Something tearing from the top is something coming apart at a point that human hands cannot reach. Mark is not vague about which direction this goes. He is precise. From top to bottom, the temple does not fall in that moment. The city does not stop. The priests do not abandon their duties. Life in Jerusalem continues in the next hours and days and years, as though nothing fundamental has shifted. And yet Mark places this image, the curtain splitting from top to bottom, in the same sentence as the death of Jesus at the 9th hour, as though the two events belong in the same breath, because they belong to the same moment. Because what happened on the hill outside the walls and what happened inside the temple sanctuary are not two separate events that happen to occur at the same time. They are one event, seen from two different places. And then Mark records what the centurion said. And the story moves forward, and the afternoon continues toward evening. But for anyone who has traveled this far through the layers of what the 9th hour carried in that world, the torn curtain is the image that gathers everything else and holds it together without explanation. The daily sacrifice at the 9th hour, the Passover memory pressing in from every direction, the 3 hours of darkness, the psalm that begins in abandonment and does not end there, the centurion saying what he was not supposed to say, the curtain torn from the top. Mark does not tell you how to hold all of that at once. He just makes sure you know it all happened in the same hour. Let us go back to the beginning. 4 people wrote accounts of the death of Jesus. They wrote in different cities, for different audiences, across different decades. They disagreed on details. They made different choices about what to include and what to leave out. They did not all mark the timing of the death in the same way. Mark and Luke are specific about the 9th hour. Matthew follows closely. John builds a different framework around the day itself, the charged calendar of Passover preparation, placing the death inside meaningful time without using the same hour markers. But none of them treats the timing of Jesus' death as accidental. None of them lets the death float outside of sacred time, outside of the rhythms and memories and layers of meaning that the hour carried in the world they all lived inside. They all refused to let that happen. The question this story started with was simple. 4 writers remembered the hour. Why? What we have found, moving through the layers of that question, is that the answer is not simple at all. It is a convergence, a place where several things that were already true about that hour, already true long before anyone ever wrote a word about Jesus, came together in a way that none of the people writing about it could fully account for, and none of them could ignore. Here is what was true about the 9th hour on that Friday afternoon in Jerusalem. The Roman world recorded the completion of a lawful execution. A condemned man had died at the 9th hour. The sentence had been carried out. The centurion had confirmed it. Pilate had registered his surprise at the speed of it and released the body. From Rome's perspective, the afternoon had produced exactly what it was supposed to produce, with the minor irregularity that it ended faster than expected. The file was closed. The hour was noted for bureaucratic purposes and then forgotten, the way Rome forgot the thousands of other hours in which it did the same thing to other people in other provinces across the empire. The Jewish world was moving through its afternoon rhythm at that same hour. The Tamid sacrifice, the daily continual offering that structured every afternoon in the temple, was underway or recently completed. The prayers of Mincha were rising from the courts. Thousands of pilgrims who had traveled to Jerusalem for Passover were living inside a story about a narrow place and a way out, about a people who were trapped with no possibility of escape, and then something happened that they had no power to make happen themselves. The whole city was saturated in the language of deliverance, and outside the walls, at the 9th hour, a man died on a Roman cross while that language was in the air all around him. The world of the Hebrew Scriptures was present at the 9th hour through the cry that came from the cross. Psalm 22, the prayer that begins in the place of abandonment and refuses to end there, was the language Jesus reached for in that moment. The darkness that had covered the land for 3 hours was the language of Amos and Joel. The sound that the prophets used when they wanted to say that something of ultimate consequence was happening, that the ordinary rules were being suspended in favor of something that ordinary rules could not contain. The curtain tore. The centurion spoke. The afternoon moved toward evening. 3 worlds, 1 hour, and the gospel writers, who lived inside all 3 simultaneously, who were formed by the Roman world they could not escape, and the Jewish world they were born into, and the scriptural world they had memorized before they could read, looked at what had happened at the 9th hour and could not separate the threads from each other. They did not try to. This is something worth understanding about how the Gospels work, something that is easy to miss if you come to them expecting a single argument made cleanly and resolved neatly. The Gospels are not trying to prove one thing. They are trying to hold multiple true things in the same space at the same time, and let the weight of all of them together do what any single one of them alone could not do. The death of Jesus at the 9th hour was a Roman execution. It was also the hour of prayer and sacrifice. It was also the hour of the cry from Psalm 22. It was also the hour when the curtain tore. All of those things are held in the same place in the text, and none of them is asked to cancel the others out or explain the others away. They exist together, in tension with each other, and in conversation with each other. The way things exist when they are true rather than when they are constructed. That is not confusion on the part of the writers. That is not a failure to arrive at a single clean interpretation and commit to it. That is the way these writers understood meaning to work. Meaning was not something you extracted by eliminating all but one layer. Meaning lived in the layers themselves, in the way they spoke to each other across centuries and texts and traditions that had not been designed to fit together but somehow did. Think about what it would have meant to be one of the first people telling this story. You are a Jewish follower of Jesus, living in the decades after the crucifixion, trying to explain to people who were not there what happened and why it matters. You do not have a single clean sentence that wraps it up. What you have is a set of resonances, a set of places where the death of Jesus touches something that was already true and already meaningful and already part of the world. Your listeners live inside. You say it was like Passover because the deliverance language fits in a way that nothing else fits. You say it happened at the hour of sacrifice because the temple rhythms that every Jewish person knows in their bones were active in that same city at that same hour. You say the psalm was there because the cry from the cross pulled the oldest prayer for the darkest moment into the center of what happened. You say the curtain tore because something about the way access works, the way the distance between human life and what it reaches toward works, shifted in that hour. You hold all of those things at once, and you say, look, all of these old true things are touching this new thing. We cannot explain it by choosing one of them. We cannot explain it at all. Not completely. Not in a way that closes the question and lets you move on. But we cannot talk about it without all of them. 2,000 years later, that convergence is still sitting in the text. The hour is still the 9th hour. The cry is still the first line of Psalm 22. The curtain is still described as tearing from top to bottom. The centurion is still standing at the foot of the cross, saying something that his world had no category for. And the question this story started with, why did they remember the hour, has turned out to be the right question all along. Because following it has led here, to the place where Rome and the temple and the Psalms and the Passover memory and the 3 hours of darkness all point to the same hour on the same afternoon, and none of them fully explains what happened there. And all of them are necessary. The hour is not a code that unlocks a secret. It is a threshold, a place where several worlds that had been running parallel to each other for centuries finally touched. And the people who were paying attention when that happened felt the contact and could not stop talking about it. That is what the gospel writers preserved when they remembered the hour. They were not preserving a timestamp. They were preserving the experience of standing at a convergence and feeling what happens when things that were always true about the world suddenly show you why they were always true. The 9th hour, 3 in the afternoon. The hour nobody counted and everyone remembered. Go back to Jerusalem one more time. Stand on the road that runs north from the city gates, the road that travelers from Galilee would have taken when they came down for Passover, the road that passed close enough to Golgotha that people walking into the city could see the crosses without stopping. He could see the 3 men dying there and keep walking because there was nothing to do about it, and stopping would only make it harder to keep moving. It is late Friday afternoon now. The sun is getting lower. The sky, which went dark at noon and stayed dark until 3, is ordinary again. The ordinary gold of late afternoon in the spring. The kind of light that makes the stones of Jerusalem look warm from a distance. The city is doing what cities do in the hour before the Sabbath begins. People hurrying to finish what needs finishing before sundown. The smell of cooking from the houses inside the walls. The sound of the temple traffic winding down for the day. On the hill, the 2 men on either side are still dying. The one in the middle is already gone. A man named Joseph from a town called Arimathea has gone to Pilate to ask for the body. Pilate, still registering mild surprise that the man is already dead, has confirmed it with the centurion and given his permission, by the time the Sabbath begins at sundown, the body will be in a tomb cut from rock nearby, wrapped in linen, with a large stone rolled across the entrance. The disciples are not there. The centurion has gone back to whatever came next on his list. The crowd has thinned to almost nothing. A small group of women, the ones who had traveled with Jesus from Galilee and could not make themselves leave, are watching from a distance, close enough to see where the body is laid. That is the end of the Friday. And then the Gospels were written. Not immediately, not in the first days, or even the first years after the crucifixion. The writing came later, after the stories had been told and retold in the communities that formed around the memory of Jesus, after the language for what people believed had happened had time to develop through the friction of trying to explain it to people who were not there. By the time Mark put his account on paper, roughly 40 years had passed. He was not recording fresh memories. He was preserving something that had already been shaped by decades of people reaching for words. And in that preservation, across 4 accounts written over the course of roughly 3 decades by 4 different writers for 4 different communities in 4 different cities, the hour survived. Think about everything that did not survive. Think about all the conversations that happened and were never written down. All the people Jesus healed whose names nobody kept. All the moments between the recorded moments that are simply gone. Return to the silence that takes most of what happens in any human life. We do not know what Jesus looked like. We do not know the sound of his voice. We do not know what he said on hundreds of ordinary days that were not ordinary to the people who were there for them. And yet, the hour survived. In 4 accounts, shaped by 4 different hands, aimed at 4 different audiences. The hour is there. There are questions this story has not answered, and will not answer, because they do not have answers that anyone has managed to close in 2,000 years of serious effort. Whether the synoptic chronology or John's chronology is closer to what actually happened on the Jewish calendar that week is a question that careful scholars are still working through. Whether the darkness over Golgotha was a physical event or a narrative signal carrying the weight of the prophetic tradition, or something that does not fit cleanly into either of those categories, is a question the text does not resolve for you. Whether the tearing of the curtain was a historical occurrence or a theological statement wearing historical language is a question that depends on commitments the text cannot make on your behalf. These are honest, open questions. They belong to the story. The story does not become smaller because they cannot be closed. It becomes the right size for what it is actually about. Here is what is not in question. The people who first told this story lived in a world where time was not neutral, where the 9th hour already carried weight before Jesus ever walked into Jerusalem, where a lamb on an altar and a prayer rising from the temple courts and a line from a psalm and 3 hours of darkness across a midday sky were all part of the same language. A language that had been developing for centuries, and that the gospel writers were completely fluent in. And when something happened at the 9th hour that they believed was the most important thing that had ever happened, they reached for that language. They placed the death inside the hour that already held sacrifice and prayer and the daily heartbeat of the temple. They let the psalm speak through the cry from the cross. They let the curtain tear without stopping to explain what the tearing meant. They let the centurion say what he said and left his words on the page for you to do something with. They were not trying to prove a point. They were trying to preserve an experience, the experience of standing at a place where several things that had been true for a very long time all pointed at the same moment, and not being able to explain it without making it smaller than it was. 2,000 years later, you are standing at the same convergence. The hour is still the 9th hour. The texts are still there. The questions are still open. The centurion still said what he said. The curtain is still described as tearing from the top. Psalm 22 still begins in the place that no one would choose and ends somewhere that could not have been predicted from the beginning. Somewhere in a city that was preparing for its oldest festival. A story about a narrow place and a way out. The afternoon light was failing, and the daily sacrifice was being completed. And a man on a hill outside the walls was using the last of his breath to pray the prayer that his tradition had already been praying for centuries into what felt like silence. The hour nobody counted. The hour everyone remembered. It is still there, waiting for whoever is willing to stand in it long enough to feel what the people who first stood there felt. Not an answer, a threshold.